So we have a hand from high stakes. We have rigged egg as our hero. He is in the big blind facing a small blind open. He 3-bets, so let's jump right into it. GTO Wizard would have this small blind opening range, and against that we have Jack 8, which would be a 3-bet 40% of the time. So that is what happens here. And we would get called 38% of the time, which is what happens here as well. The flop is Jack 10 for rainbow, and we see that rigged egg chooses to check behind, which is totally fine. We will look into the solution right away, but the flop would be a bet and a check mixing almost evenly. So now on the turn we see Barack Whispered, who is the small blind, they check, and rigged egg goes ahead and bets 50% pot. That is as well very much in line with GTO. So here small blind would check 60% of the time, so can't be too wrong to have a checking range here. Against the check, when choosing 50% pot as your only size, we would go ahead and bet Jack 8 most of the time, but not always, almost 90%. So sometimes we just want to check a hand like 2-pair as well, but most of the time we just want to get as much money in as possible when we have such a strong hand, which is mostly good enough to bet for 2 streets from the turn on. But sets do check more than 30% here, and 2-pair at least check 14% of the time as well. So when we get called on the turn, which is what happens here, and we see the river, which is a king, we have something we want to get the answer to. And at first glance, it might look obvious that you can bet here because you have a strong hand. Your opponent hasn't shown any sign of strength so far. Of course, he could have rivered some 2-pair, maybe a straight with ace queen, but other than that, you wouldn't really expect your actual opponent to show up with too many strong hands here, would you? However, in GTO that looks a little bit different. So first of all, they would have a small donking range, but since that doesn't happen and probably doesn't happen too much in practice either, we will just go ahead and look at the betting node. Here, when we choose a size of 75% pot, which is a bet size I chose for a reason, which we will look into in a minute, then Jack 8 would go ahead and bet around 40% of the time. But those 40% are not distributed equally, so basically only Jack of Hearts can bet almost always, and the other combos mostly check. Which means that this exact combo would not be a bet in this exact line. However, rigged egg is betting here, and the reason I chose 75% pot is simply because rigged egg did choose 75% pot as his bet. So according to GTO, this would not be a bet actually. Why is that? Well, it's because the small blind would arrive at this node with quite a few good hands. So more than 18% of the time would be 2-pair. Almost 4% would be sets. So 8s would check call most of the time here on the turn. And 10s would also slow play here some of the amount of the time. Straights would arrive here. Ace queen would take this line almost always, checking the flop, check calling the turn. But then they would even donk here. So in practice, they might even end up in this exact line where they check the river more often because population maybe doesn't donk as often. At the same time, it's probably unlikely they check call pocket 8s on the turn 100% of the time or close to that. Some 10-8 probably bet the turn most often. The 2-pairs that are 2-pair on the turn as well, like Jack 10 or others, maybe even top pairs on the turn like King Jack would also bet more often than the solution would. In any case, it might be much more of a bet for all Jack-8 combos in reality. But that is not even the question here. So what I want to get into is if we decide to bet and we say we decide Jack-8 is good enough to value bet here against our specific opponent, talking about mid-stakes and lower in this example, even though this is high stakes, I believe most of the viewers will play mid-stakes and lower. If we decide that we can bet Jack-8 here for value, what is the best bet size we can choose? And if we ask the solver, we can go ahead and enter a lot of bet sizes here. Though, according to the solver, the bigger ones would be used most of the time. So here 150 and 230% pot would be the most used ones, meaning we polarize our range very much. We mostly bet straights for an all-in sizing, some 150 as well. Sets can also then go ahead and overbet a lot, but not jam too often. But then we would only be able to value bet King Jack, some King 4, and then a tiny amount of Jack 8 here. That is what the solver says. But as we already saw, if we choose to not overbet or not include an overbet size, we can see what the solution would look like then. But even then, the threshold is actually within the two-pair region. So here, even including a 50% and a 33% pot size, solver would bet Jack 8, this exact combo, only around half the time. However, population play like the solver, no, we usually know that. And so what we can look at is how does population react in this exact line. So check, check, flop, check, call, turn, and then check, call, river. How do they play in this exact line? We can look at a larger number of data. What's even better is that there is a tool that actually does that for you. It's called Snap MDA. And with this tool, you can not only go to the exact line you want to look at in the exact formation, and then have it show you how often people actually call compared to GTO. So here, the overall frequency in this line would be 37%, and GTO would also check call 37%. So this is the GTO number. You can compare that to population's actual number, but you can also compare the actual sizes and how often population and GTO would check call against the exact sizes. And what we see here is that for 75% pot, this little arrow goes up and is green. And what that means is that population check calls more often against a 75% pot bet than GTO would. So they overcall, and they call 40% of the time here, when GTO would only check call 36% of the time in this exact line against this exact river bet size. And right away, we can also see that against all other bet sizes that we have data for GTO here, population actually undercalls. So this red little arrow goes down and shows us that population's frequency is lower than GTO. So here, against the 33% pot bet on the river, population check calls 40% of the time, but GTO would call 53% of the time. So a 13% overfold by population. Against 150, they also overfold by around 3 percentage points. Against pot size, they also overfold around 10 percentage points. And against 125% pot, they also overfold by around 4 percentage points. Which means that the only bet size we want to use if we want to get value from our opponents should be the 75% pot bet, because against that, the average opponent, the average regular, overcalls. So they call more often, which is exactly what we want when we are value betting. And for that reason, this exact size is also the best exploitative one. Therefore, probably much better to bet 75% pot and to bet it with every single hand that is 2-pair, and probably even with our overpairs that make it to this spot. Maybe even some top pairs can value bet here as well, because after all, population calls more often than GTO would, so we can value bet thinner. We could also bluff less often because population would check call more often, or we could just use a different bet size for our bluffs. For example, one where population overfolds against. So either we could choose a 33% bet size and have population overfold against that, because they should, in theory, call many low pairs, for example, or even ace highs, which they wouldn't. Or we just use a bigger bet size like pot, which has one of the highest overfolding frequencies by 10 percentage points, and just leverage the fact that population check folds many, I don't know, second pairs maybe, that they should call against this size. That's what exploiting on a very precise level looks like. And also, if you're interested in Snap MDA, working with this tool, I will leave a link down below as well. You can get 10% off. Other than that, I'm not affiliated with this tool, but it's maybe even my favorite tool to work with as of now, just because you can do so much and it's extremely helpful for analyzing population's tendencies. Here we see that using 75% pot actually paid off. Barack did check call ace 10, third pair, which, as we can see, is not a call. So he did actually overcall here. Whether that's representative of high stakes or just very situational, I'm not sure, but it is definitely something, or an example of what you would see more often on lower stakes and mid stakes than you would in GTO. And in this instance, it also worked very well in rigged X favor. So if you want to apply something like this more often yourself and increase your win rate, you know what to do.